I'm Jen Gustetic. I'm the Prizes and Challenges Program Executive for NASA. I work for the Chief Technologist. So there's 3 chiefs at NASA. There's a chief scientist, there's a chief technologist, there's a chief engineer. And so the chief technologist works on a lot of the content related to space technology and aeronautics technology. So we work on topics ranging from atomic clocks to keep our satellites and spacecraft ticking, to deep space navigation, to CubeSats, so small satellites that are the future architectures for a lot of the spacecraft that we're looking at to go to deep space, as well as aircraft research. So a lot of research that's happening on aircraft, like when you see icing on wings, that's a big problem because if ice breaks off into the engine, it'd be a bad day for you on your flight. We do a lot of aeronautics research as well. So it's the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So we say sometimes people forget the first day in NASA, but we do aeronautics too. It's not just space stuff. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about how NASA uses crowdsourcing to accomplish our mission as well. And am I not, is this not on maybe? Or am I, I work at NASA and I can't make this work. This happens a lot actually. We have big IT problems at NASA. Is it not on? It's on. I can also just push the button. Is it working? Okay, all right, I'll just push the button. It's fine, I can do it. I like to move around. All right, thank you. Okay, so many of you may not know that NASA's been doing prizes, challenges, and crowdsourcing since 2005, which is like crazy history time when you think about how long this stuff has been around. But since 2005, we have been using prizes and challenges. We have a lot of different programs that we use to run prizes, challenges, and crowdsourcing activities. So how many of you guys have heard of the Ansari X Prize? How many of you have heard of Richard Branson? So Richard Branson acquired the technology that was developed as a result of the $10 million Ansari X Prize, which was Spaceship One, which is the basis, the technology basis for the new suborbital spaceflight technology that they're going to be using for Virgin Galactic flights that should be starting in the next year. And so really beginning the whole emergence of an emerging suborbital space tourism industry was stimulated through a prize competition. Well, and I'll just do it, Epi, don't worry, okay. So at NASA, we've learned from the methods that the X Prize Foundation used in the early 2000s with the Ansari X Prize, and have been running our own big technology development and demonstration prizes since 2005 with the Centennial Challenges program. I'll talk a little bit about this specific example later, but the types of things that we get out of crowdsourcing and prizes vary drastically. So we can get hardware, actual flight hardware. That's flight hardware. That's a simulated moon lander. These teams built that and brought it to a demonstration event. We also get software, algorithms, code. We get a lot of stuff that can be submitted through a computer. You don't have to actually bring your hardware to an event and test it against other people's hardware. You can submit your solutions online via platforms, which is more in line with a lot of the things that we've heard about the last day and a half. But it's also the in-person, offline crowdsourcing that we care about as well. And hearing about the Earth activity right after lunch, we've got an effort called the International Space Apps Challenge. This is an image from the International Space Apps Challenge that I've got to believe was inspired by what you guys did. I have to go and talk to the organizers for Space Apps. This is the 3rd year of running the International Space Apps Challenge. It happens in 75 cities across the globe. It's a 48-hour hackathon where we bring people together, not just working on questions of code, but also hardware, design. There's video production that happens over the weekend too. It's not just folks working to hack that you typically think of when you think of a hackathon weekend. But last year, over 8,000 people participated globally in 75 countries on 50 challenges, and they were working on topic areas for global good using NASA data, and on assets to try to get more people involved in their space program. And so when I hear about what you guys have done, I think that's so super inspiring and very much in line with the purpose of the International Space Apps Challenge, which is to give people a little bit of area to play in, but ultimately it's about mass collaborations to get people more engaged in space and the problems that we're trying to help address every day with NASA. But that's ideas and methods. That's not necessarily code or like a general aviation aircraft that's being created as a result of these crowdsourcing activities. It's a different type of product. Next slide. So there's a lot of different products that we get out of crowdsourcing activities, and that we get out of prizes and challenges. And there's different benefits to those. So sometimes we have a problem that we want solved, and we're looking at crowdsourcing to get us a solution to that problem faster and cheaper. Sometimes we have a technology that we know that we need for a mission 10 years down the road. Doesn't exist today. There are not companies that are creating that technology. And so we will issue a challenge and see if it's possible. See if we can demonstrate a proof of concept and advance the state of the art in a particular technology area. And part of what we're hoping happens there can be the creation of new companies to deliver those services to us down the road. So who are we going to buy it from? We actually need sustainable companies out of that as well that are able to produce that technology. Sometimes just ideas, getting a bunch of ideas to inform our engineers as they're going through the design process or to inform our scientists out of discipline perspectives can be very, very valuable for us. It's not necessarily about the final product or the emergence of companies. It's about the diversity of ideas. So one thing that I like to say to those folks that we're trying to persuade within NASA to use more of these tools is, if you've seen one prize, you've seen one prize. They're all different. They're all different. And they can have very different, wildly different objectives. So it's very, very important at the end, or at the very, very beginning of defining your problem, to understand what your top two objectives are. You're not going to get all of these things with one prize, challenge, or crowdsourcing activity. If you're trying to get all those things, then you're way overshooting and you're going to be super disappointed. You need to pick a couple of these things that are your primary objectives, your primary outcomes that you're trying to get out of a particular challenge, because the design of that activity will be driven by those objectives. That sounds so, well, obviously, duh, but you would be amazed at how many people don't specify their objectives at the beginning and end up designing for something that they didn't want at the end. In math and engineering, we say a lot garbage in, garbage out. Like if you have bad data or if you have a bad formula, you're going to get bad stuff at the end. So next slide. Oh, now it works. Yay. The other important point about this slide is that this is one tool in NASA's toolkit. So we're very, very good at issuing contracts. We're very, very good at issuing grants to universities. We're talking about tapping an entirely new population of potential problem solvers and contributors to really hard problems through prizes, challenges, and crowdsourcing. The individual, which is not something that government is really good at working with, because we didn't have methods. We didn't have ways to like give them money for their idea. They had to have this like CCR and DUNS number and be registered on a non-prohibited list to be a government vendor in order to pay them. Right? That stuff is actually procedurally really hard to pay an individual if you're a government. And part of what's been happening over the last several years is figuring out how we get the processes in place that we can engage with individuals, not just in a conversation or not just pushing information out and saying, look at the pretty pictures NASA takes. Because we do take a lot of really beautiful images of the galaxy and the universe. But it's not just about looking at what we do because we're so smart. It's getting you engaged and helping to do that as well and do it better and do more. And being able to interact with you in a meaningful way, and sometimes that means paying you, is something we've had to figure out how to do as a government. That's not easy. So I'm going to run through a few examples here of just how the types of problems that we have posed out to the community through crowdsourcing. So this is the International Space Station. 13 years now, we've had a sustained human presence on the International Space Station. There's been an American on the ISS since the very beginning. So 13 years, we've been living in space. These things that are at the top, these things at the top, these are the solar panel collectors. They're called longerons, because we have to call things really weird names. It's actually interesting that it's a term and it's not an acronym, because we have acronyms for acronyms at NASA. So these are longerons. And these are what we use to generate power for the International Space Station. It's all solar powered based. The problem that we were facing here was that as the International Space Station rotates around or orbits around the Earth, it takes different positions relative to the sun, the longerons. So as you're rotating, in one moment you might have all of your longerons perfectly exposed to the sun and you're like basking in it like an Australian beach getting burned. And you're getting maximum power yield in that situation. If you've got a suboptimal angle with respect to the sun, you've got two problems. One, you're not getting maximum energy draw because you're not having full exposure to the sun on the solar panels. Two, you're getting shadowing. That's a problem because space gets really cold in the shade, really cold. And these solar panels are sensitive to cold and big changes in temperature. And so you don't want to have them shadowed for too long and too frequently because they can crack. And then that's an even bigger problem. Because it took a long time for this thing to build, and they're not going out and doing spacewalks to replace solar panels every other day when they've cracked. So the challenge that we posed to the Topcoder community, how many of you have heard of Topcoder? So Topcoder is a crowdsourcing platform. They are a crowdsourcing platform that has 500,000 members globally of coders. We pose problems to Topcoder, and they break those down into a series of contests that they pose to the community in order to develop that solution, whether it be complete software packages, whether it be algorithms, whether it be models, whether it be data science approaches. They basically do problem decomposition where in order to get we did one challenge with the Center for Medicaid Services in the US, and it was to develop an entire Medicaid enrollment module. That's a huge software package that we assumed that they said would have cost around $6 million if they paid a traditional contractor to do it. They broke it down to 120 mini contests, and those things aggregated up into the final solution. It was big systems engineering. It was a big software development SDLC process. It ended up costing them $1 million to do it through Topcoder through 140 micro contests, as opposed to the $6 million that it would have cost them, they estimated, through a traditional contracting approach. So we did this for developing a better model for orienting the International Space Station based on solar angle to maximize energy utilization while minimizing shadowing. That's a question we posed to the developer community on on Topcoder and said, build us a better model. Help us do this better. It's a big problem, big operational problem. And for the equivalent of $80,000 and 3 weeks of a tournament on the NASA Tournament Lab, we got 4,000 registered solvers, 4,000 people around the globe that wanted to participate, 500 people that actually ended up competing, 2,000 submissions for potential solutions to this, and 10 winners for this particular problem set. And a total of $40,000 was available for prize money. So you can see that the vendor has some overhead to conduct the challenge if the total cost was about $80,000. We estimated that for a similar project in-house, it would have been over $250K for a 6-month study, not even necessarily developing the solution. And this was a completely open source model, what we developed in Topcoder. This is a really hard problem. And we got a solution that performed as good as the major contractor developed solution that we'd been using for 13 years and had to task the contractor to go out and run the simulation and tell us how to move the beta angles of the joint assemblies. We got a solution that met that degree of accuracy within 3 weeks on Topcoder from non-aerospace experts. It's really phenomenal, the results that we've been able to get. This is another example, real quick, of a challenge that we ran on 3 platforms, actually. So we experiment with what crowdsourcing platforms are best for what type of problem. We ran this particular challenge on 3 platforms: Incentive, Yet2, and then our internal ideation platform, which basically allows us to go out to all NASA employees across the centers and ask them for potential solutions to a topic before we go outside. So we went inside first. We asked our internal population for ideas on this challenge. I'll tell you what the problem is in a second. I'm making you hang on. Second, we went to incentive. Third, we went to yet to. So the problem here is you probably have heard in space you lose bone density. Astronauts lose bone density because of the lack of gravity. The other thing that we've identified that's a problem for long-term human presence in space is actually loss of vision. So astronauts that have been on the International Space Station for long periods of time will come back and report losses of vision. And we think that that's because they're experiencing changes in intracranial pressure in that environment in microgravity. So in order to test that, they actually need to have measurements of your intracranial pressure over time before you go, while you're there, when you come back, in order to make that correlation, to actually say that that is what's causing this vision loss, and then be able to come up with treatments for it. Part of what we were looking at before we started investing in invasive technologies, invasive means drilling in head, was if there are non-invasive technologies for measuring intracranial pressure. The people on the International Space Station aren't necessarily doctors. Your astronaut buddy isn't necessarily a doctor. I wouldn't want him drilling into my head. So are there non-invasive methods to be able to measure intracranial pressure? We asked this question out through those platforms to see if there were other potential ways that we could be, research paths that we could be looking into before we made the multi-million-dollar investments that we were going to be making to mitigate that human risk of having people in space. And it ended up being that there were, the incentive challenge was a $15,000 award. One $15,000 award was made out of the incentive challenge, which identified an algorithm-based approach using measurements that were already able to be taken on the International Space Station with devices they already have there, deriving intracranial pressure measure from other measurements that you could, health measurements that you could take. This actually, interestingly, that solution was proposed for a NASA grant, a NASA Small Business Innovative Research Grant a few years before, but was a relatively immature technology or approach, so it wasn't funded. It had matured in the last few years, and there was no other way that we would have seen that idea, again, if it hadn't have been for this particular method of sourcing ideas in this area. So we had heard of this idea before, but it was a way to revisit it. That was a benefit that we found in this particular scenario. So these are inflatables. It's a different structure, a way to build stuff in space. The International Space Station is rigid metals that are set up, whole modules that are set up and then constructed in space. There's a whole other concept, this guy Bigelow, who owns a lot of hotels, that actually has a purpose in life to have space hotels. So you can see Richard Branson and Elon Musk developing people or sending people on their new vehicles that they're creating to space hotels. Someday it will be a whole new industry in low Earth orbit. If you want to take vacation someday looking down on Earth. But they're thinking about constructing those types of environments with inflatables. So you send out basically the bladder of a balloon and you blow it up in space. So it's a different structure. It's a different structure completely. It's not hard metal sides. Stress and strain on these devices are also spread out differently on the surfaces. We were having trouble in some of our centers in actually accurately measuring the strain on some of these materials. It's called Kevlar and Vectran web straps is kind of what one of the internal bladders are used. It's the materials that are used for internal bladders on these things. We're having trouble using traditional methods. So in a lot of traditional methods for measuring that kind of stuff in lab strain, in labs you pull on them and then you put fluorescent light on the object and then you take a picture of the object, and based on how it fluoresces back, you can tell what the strain measurement is on some of those materials. Well, the problem with these materials is the pixels twisted when you were taking pictures on it, and it was difficult to get an accurate strain measurement. And they struggled with this problem for 6 months. The engineers in the lab, they couldn't get the right reading test measurement to measure the right strain. So we asked on incentive, is there a better way to measure a strain on these straps? People, tell us. $20,000 later, which is nothing compared to the time that you pay for a NASA engineer, a team of NASA engineers to be looking at this problem. For $20,000, we got 3 very similar solutions that came in about actually attaching a rubber jig to the same test strap and then taking the measurement off the rubber jig, correlating that back to the material. And we just couldn't see the forest. Yeah, NASA engineer, correlating rubber to the metals. Anyway. We couldn't see the forest for the trees. We were still in the details. And we were only going to pay $20,000 for a solution if we actually got a solution to our problem. So in this particular case, you can pose the problem out, and you're really at very low risk here. Like if it was an impossible problem to solve, then you don't pay the prize money. That's very different from contracts, where you're paying hourly for someone to solve a problem for you, and there's no guarantee that they're actually going to do it. So in this case, we awarded the money because someone told us how to do it. This is an image of the thing that you saw earlier actually flying. This is the Mast and Space System team that came together for the Lunar Lander Challenge in 2009. The interesting little tidbit about this prize, $2 million prize. They actually had to build this thing. They didn't get any money from us. They built this thing. They brought it to a demonstration event. They showed that this could take off from one landing pad, from a takeoff pad, travel up vertically a certain number of feet, and then travel horizontally, and then land within a few inches of accuracy on another landing pad. It simulates the lunar environment, kind of what lunar landers have to be able to do in that environment, given you actually have atmosphere here and different gravity situations. So we derive some of the technology needs that we would get out of that particular simulation. But the team that won this was not the favorite. So the team that won this, Armadillo Aerospace, was the one that everyone thought was going to win. And they actually, the way that we structured this prize competition was that they had 3 months to demonstrate. They could pick where they demonstrated and when. They just had to let us know so that we could send a judge to it. But it's strategic to pick where in the window you demonstrate, right? So Armadillo was like, we've got this. We're going to go first. We're just going to get it out of the way and then get back to our business. So they demonstrated first. They did it. They beat the minimum performance criteria. But then Mast and Space Systems, at the end of that 3-month period, signed up, did it, and they did better than what Armadillo did in the minimum performance, in beating the minimum performance criteria. And they ended up winning. They took home $1.15 million, and Armadillo took home $750K as a result of getting second place. And these two became real companies in the aerospace industry. Those two competitors in that challenge. I actually have a quote that I want to read for you from one of the founders of Mast and Space Systems that I think really articulates why teams will spend their own development money and time. Sometimes it's buddies from Robot Wars that get together on the weekends and work on this stuff together. Sometimes it's father-son teams. It's amazing the types of people that actually come together and register to be teams and work on this stuff. One of my favorite stories, actually, was the Astronaut Glove Challenge that we had. You can see the Flag Suit LLC Astronaut Glove down here at the bottom. The problem there was, imagine having trying to do spacewalks and grapple with tools and not being able to bend your fingers. It's like hyper pressurized on your fingers in order to keep you pressurized. And so grabbing things creates a lot of blisters, and it's just very uncomfortable on your hands, the gloves used to be. So they were looking at new ways to stitch joints and make the gloves more flexible. The guy that ended up getting second place in that competition one of the years was actually a Victoria's Secret designer who used to design the wings for the runway shows that they do. Yeah, he won that NASA glove challenge and started a company called Flag Suit LLC out of it. But these are companies that didn't really exist in the way that they exist now before participating in a challenge. So let me read you the quote. The timing of the Lunar Lander Challenge lined up with technical goals we already needed to achieve in the development of our vehicles, and we decided to pursue the challenge along the way. With a lot of hard work and a little bit of luck, we managed to take home the grand prize. This is Mast and Space Systems. When we won the challenge, our only customer was the challenge. We had 2 great rocket vehicles with fantastic guidance and control, but an extremely limited sales funnel. Since the challenge, we've spent time building a business around a primary focus on customers. We received multiple awards from NASA to fly suborbital payloads in this time, as well as established NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and other major aerospace contractors as customers. So they used the challenge as a means to demonstrate viability in their product and viability in a pretty big company-dominated aerospace industry in order to be able to, they have the street cred now of winning a NASA challenge and have developed new customers as a result of that. And that's the same as a lot of these other companies. This plane flew at a NASA Centennial Challenge and won it. These people are building hardware, sophisticated hardware. We saw the stuff yesterday that the local motors folks are building. This stuff is being built by teams for NASA prize money. A few other derivatives on this crowdsourcing thing. So we've tried to experiment more in recent years with different ways of using crowdsourcing for different purposes at the agency as well. And you'll see links on the bottom if you want to go to find out any more about these particular activities. This is a challenge that we're doing right now with Marblar. It's a name that's unfortunately kind of difficult to pronounce. M-A-R-B-L-A-R. NASA has a long history of doing technology transfer. That means in our labs, we invent new stuff. And we patent the good stuff. And then we try to get companies to license those patents and then develop new commercial products or uses in other markets of those inventions. It's a whole thing called spin-offs. That NASA promotes. We do a lot. It's maybe where you've heard like NASA invented Velcro, which we didn't. But there's a lot of things that you've heard NASA spin-offs have created. There is a ton of stuff. The camera in your phone you wouldn't have if it wasn't for basic NASA technology. There's a lot of things that are spin-offs of NASA inventions. And there's only so much that we can do to imagine what NASA technologies and patents could be used for. And so one of the things that we do is something called market assessments on our high potential patents. We go out, we do market assessments on those, and then we target trying to reach out to those types of markets to make them aware of the patents so that more people are using it and you see new technologies and new commercial uses of NASA patents. On Marblar, which is kind of like a quirky, NASA posted 40 of our patents. We've got many, many more of those, but this was a pilot project. We posted 40 of our patents. And we were paying Marblar, what NASA got out of it, we are paying Marblar to give us market assessments that are created by an ideation process within that community. So they've got the community that's ideating what these different patents could be used for. Then they create market assessments for us out of that for about $2,500 a pop is what we're paying them for a market assessment. A market assessment usually costs us about $20,000 a pop. So it's a way cheaper way to get a market assessment using crowdsourcing. But what Marblar is in turn doing, that is in no way attached to NASA, disclaimer, disclaimer, is partnering with commercial partners like Samsung to say, if there are good ideas for commercial products that come in, Samsung will work to help develop those products and work to actually get the license from NASA, because it's not like they have to get a license, they have to pay royalties, all of that stuff, but the ideator on the platform then shares in the royalties with the commercial partner. So we have partnered with them for market assessments, but they've got this whole other thing going on that's really trying to encourage commercial use of NASA technologies. So here you see, how many of you have heard of Zooniverse? Zooniverse. So this is an example of citizen science, which is a completely different way of looking at crowdsourcing. We don't pay people to participate in citizen science. In citizen science activities, a lot of it is human pattern recognition. They look at images and they can help classify stuff for us in ways that are much more quicker and efficient than our algorithms are currently doing it. So what you're seeing on the screen right now are images from the WISE spacecraft. The WISE spacecraft takes imagery out into the universe in infrared wavelengths. And we use the WISE data for a lot of different things, but in this particular activity, it's called Disk Detective. We're looking for disks that indicate the early formation of planets. Going through all this data to try to look for disks. And we use algorithms to try to find it within this huge data set, but we also engage the citizen science community in their lunch break, clicking, all right, is that multiple objects in a red circle? Is that an empty circle in the WISE image? Like, they classify this stuff for us. This was a project that was just launched 2 months ago. We already have 500,000 classifications. We have over 5,000 registered users. More than 100,000 people visited the website during the first month of the project, and real science is being done here. So this isn't just like a fun, public outreach activity that kids can do in their spare time. Real scientific papers get published out of what they learn from these classification activities. 65 papers in credible academic journals have been published in space, in the topic of space, out of Zooniverse activities. So it's not just technology development that we're using crowdsourcing for. We're using crowdsourcing techniques for advancing science and research as well. Sound, let me go back real quick. So before I go into this next one, this is an example. Now it really comes down to what's at stake here for crowdsourcing when NASA's talking about making this a tool in our toolkit. Two examples of what's at stake. How many of you guys saw the dash cam footage last year from when the meteor hit Russia? Dash cams, you know, like that was on Russian cars, a lot of people screaming as like they see this big like fireball come down into northern Russia. Yeah, you guys probably, I'm sure more of you saw that than are raising your hands. Asteroids actually are a pretty big problem in that they do hit us quite a bit. A lot of times they burn up in the atmosphere on the way down. If they're smaller than about 20 meters, they're going to burn up on the way down. You get these nice little fireballs that you see on the way down. That's why we have so many meteors, right? You can buy meteors. You can go online and buy a meteor. Those came from space. Those are space rocks, people. Those are from former asteroids. And they're abundant on our planet. The big ones, the ones that are going to be a really bad day for the planet, like the ones that were a really bad day for the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, those are things that are about 1,000 meters or bigger. We know where 95 to 97% of those are. None of them are an impact trajectory on the next 100 years, so you can exhale. We're good on like the planet killers. But there's a lot of them that are city killers, region killers, continent killers, that we don't know where they are because we've really only been looking since 1998. And NASA's had a program since 1998 called the NEO program to find these objects, track them, characterize them. And the reason why characterization is important is because there's a big difference about what it means for the planet if it's like a rubble pile that comes into our atmosphere or if it's solid iron. A big difference about what's going to burn down and what kind of impact that would have on the planet. So we have to characterize them. We have to know what they're made of, and that takes observation from the ground looking up. And there's a lot of ways that citizen scientists and people from around the globe can get involved in this activity. This is one of the reasons why I'm going to Australia tomorrow for 5 days around the International Space Apps Challenge, which is actually happening this year, this weekend, is to try to appeal to more folks in the southern hemisphere to spend their observation time looking at asteroids and not necessarily, or in addition to, the planets and the stars and the other stuff that they look at. That's all well and good. But we're also trying to increase kind of global crowdsourcing activities on protecting the planet from asteroids. That's a big thing at stake. We're talking about actually designing a program at NASA that relies on accelerating the work that the professionals are doing by bringing in individuals from around the globe in a meaningful way to protecting the planet from asteroids. It's pretty cool. We're creating a global lead of asteroid hunters. You can be an asteroid hunter with NASA. We even have open source graphics that show like, you know, a kid like shooting, like a parent shooting a laser gun at the sky, and then the kid with like his little, whatever these things are called, what are those things? Yeah, slingshot, slingshot asteroid hunters, to try to get more people involved in the quest. Now, it doesn't take a telescope in your backyard, though. There are ways you can get involved from an algorithm perspective, and that's what I was setting up the next slide in a very long-winded way to say. So this is a video we've got, if you can turn up the volume.
While most like to hang out in the asteroid belt, roughly between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, many have orbits that come close to, or sometimes even impact Earth. With asteroids being the most plentiful objects in our solar system, you'd think they'd be easier to find. But if you look up at the night sky, even with a powerful telescope, the best you're going to get is a small dot that looks just like a star. Well then, how do scientists find asteroids? They compare a series of telescope images to see if anything in the picture moved relative to the others. If it does, then it might be an asteroid. Scientists used to do this comparison by hand, but there is now so much data that they need to use computer algorithms to sift through the data to try to make these initial detections. If they spot something, a scientist will then review the results to make sure it's accurate. And now, there are two potential issues with this process. One, if the computer misses something, then that asteroid won't get discovered this time around, leaving us vulnerable to potential asteroid impacts or missing out on opportunities like mining the asteroids for resources. The other is if you turn up the sensitivity on these algorithms, you end up with a lot of detections called false positives, where the computer mistakenly thinks some noise in the image or a speck of dust on the lens of the telescope is an asteroid. This causes a lot more work for the scientists who have to go back over all these images and correct any of those false positives. We need your help to improve the algorithms that are used to detect asteroids without grossly increasing the number of false positives. During these challenges, we will ask you to create algorithms that mimic how humans sort through data to discover asteroids, so organizations like NASA and Planetary Resources can rely on having the most accurate data in the world. This is why NASA and Planetary Resources are asking you to help with the hunt for asteroids. Join the competitors in the Asteroid Data Hunter Challenge, being launched on the Topcoder platform, brought to you through the Harvard NASA Tournament Lab. Your algorithm just might be what helps us detect an asteroid headed for Earth, or one of the valuable resources that helps fuel future space missions deep into our solar system. Join the challenge today.
So this is actually a challenge that we've got live right now. The first marathon match, which is to develop the first round of algorithms, starts on April 18th. We had our first, this is where I said there's a series of contests. It gets broken down into a series of contests that actually build up to the final product. There's 10 contests part of this particular challenge. The first contest has just completed. We're in the middle of the second one, and the third, which is really the big one, the marathon match, starts April 18th. So we're creating ways, we're looking at the big, pardon my French, the big-ass problem of finding asteroid threats to human populations and knowing what to do about them, and finding ways in that problem that we can make crowdsourcing meaningfully contribute to a piece of that bigger problem. So it's a way that we're looking at kind of the broad system and identifying the types of problems that can be tackled through this approach. That's what's at stake. We're asking people to help us get involved in asteroid hunting. So it's serious. It's not just fun public outreach stuff. One other thing, do I have 4 minutes to show the 7 Minutes of Terror video? Okay, so how many of you have seen the 7 Minutes of Terror video, the Mars Curiosity landing? Okay, good. This is super fun. So it was between two things that I was going to show, but this is another thing of what's at stake. I'm about to show you a video that shows just how hard what we do at NASA is. And we're talking about creating on-roads and creating parts of these problems that individuals around the globe can be part of and be part of helping to solve those problems. And so this video, to set it up, we landed a rover on Mars about a year and a half ago called the Curiosity rover. If you don't follow that Twitter account, it's a really, really good Twitter account, Mars Curiosity Twitter account. Also, there's a version of it that's a non-NASA site, I'd have to say that, called Sarcastic Rover. And that might be the best Twitter account I follow. It's hilarious. Follow Sarcastic Rover. If you haven't, it's not a NASA account, I have to specify that. But they do really, really great, yeah. So this is actually a video that the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is in California, put together to tell people just how hard it was to land that rover on Mars. So the Curiosity rover is the size of an SUV. It was really, really hard to land, a huge technical challenge. It's what we...
It looks crazy.
Here, we'll start that from the beginning.
That's a very natural thing.
So I'm going to stop talking and let you watch just how hard landing the thing. This isn't even operating it. Okay.
When people look at it,
Okay,
it looks crazy. That's a very natural thing. Sometimes when we look at it, it looks crazy. It is the result of reasoned engineering thought. But it still looks crazy. From the top of the atmosphere down to the surface, it takes us 7 minutes. It takes 14 minutes or so for the signal from the spacecraft to make it to Earth. That's how far Mars is away from us. So when we first get word that we've touched the top of the atmosphere, the vehicle has been alive or dead on the surface.
So what you've got to do is go online to YouTube when we've got better service and watch 7 Minutes of Terror. It's what it's called. This set it up to let you know 14 minutes to communicate from Earth to Mars, 14 minutes to send a signal to our spacecraft. And the descent from the top of the atmosphere to the surface of Mars was 7 minutes. So for 14 minutes, we didn't know whether or not we had actually landed or crashed into the surface. And this was an incredibly difficult landing maneuver. They had to slow, the problem with the Martian atmosphere is that there's not very much of it. So on Earth, when we land, there's so much of it that it slows us down when we're coming down through traditional entry, descent, and landing approaches. There's not enough. If we came down the same way that we came on Earth, we'd smack into the surface of Mars. So we need to give ourselves some additional, we need to slow down a lot more coming into the surface of Mars. Traditional parachutes don't work because there's not enough air to grab. They don't slow us down enough. If you use rockets to slow you down, reverse rockets to slow you down, then you're going to brush up all this dust because it's a big desert. You're going to brush up all this dust and cover your scientific instruments. Goodbye to all the imagery that you wanted to take while you were on the surface of Mars. It's a huge problem how you land heavy stuff on the surface. So there was this really innovative approach that they took called a sky crane, where they actually imagine a series where you have a heat shield. It's slowing you down. The heat shield is slowing you down to a certain amount. You eject the heat shield. Then all of a sudden, your parachute comes out. Your parachute slows you down slightly more than that, but not enough to land. You eject the parachute because you don't want it to get caught on other stuff. You eject the parachute, and then you put on your reverse boosters to slow you down a bunch. But you have to do that like 100 meters above the surface so you're not stirring up dirt. And so now you're hovering 100 meters above the surface of Mars, waiting to get your rover out of the shell, that's delivering it. And we start lowering it on what we call a sky crane, ropes, from this hovering shell that's delivering this SUV to the surface of Mars. And it's lowering it on ropes, and then the ropes cut, and all of a sudden the shell has to fly away in the opposite direction so it doesn't fall on the Curiosity rover. And so it gets thrown away in the opposite direction, does another after booster activity to get thrown away in the opposite direction, and now all of a sudden you've got this rover sitting alone on Mars after all of that, and after over 9 months of travel time to get it there. So it's been traveling for 9 months. It's been in development in the lab for 10 years, and it all comes down to a 7-minute landing sequence that they've never done before, and they don't know if it's going to work, and everything has to work perfectly. And then they don't even know for 7 minutes if it actually landed. So that's kind of what the video runs you through in a very dramatic way. And maybe you guys have heard of Mohawk Guy, which is one of the guys that become like an international sensation after the landing of this, because it was being projected all around the world. The mission control at JPL, where these guys who have spent a decade of their life more working on this spacecraft are crying. These old men are crying and tearing their hair and so excited because it just landed and they know it landed, and there's nothing they can do for correction maneuvers at that point. Like, they're getting the data in to know if the parachute operated correctly, to know if the cords were cut correctly, and they're finding these out after 7 minutes after. They can't make any changes, right? They're just fine. It's like watching a TV show that they can't control. And the excitement that happened at the end of this was incredible, the amount of energy that these guys had. And one of the guys in the room was this like 20-something Mohawk dude. He cut his hair in a Mohawk. He was a younger guy. People didn't think that was NASA. Like, NASA can't be young people. But he became like an international sensation because he wasn't the old white dude that everyone thinks of as being NASA. He was a young guy with a Mohawk. And so he went and did the Walking Dead TV show, like talk show Talking Dead. Like, they love him. The people love him. Now, he's like a celebrity. It's kind of crazy. But this type of stuff, software that powers these spacecraft, ideas for how you actually build smaller, more robust spacecraft. These are the types of things that we're talking about, compartmentalizing pieces of the problem so that folks can contribute to parts of this stuff through crowdsourcing. Landing stuff on other planets. So there's a lot at stake with the way that NASA thinks about crowdsourcing. Also, we don't have room for error. We have no margin for error on that kind of thing. That's a $6 billion mission. You don't want to screw that up because the dude that created the code through crowdsourcing made some 0 or 1 error. So there's a huge amount of stuff at stake with that, but that also means that we take it very seriously. We really are figuring out how to inject this new way of doing business into our business model in a way where it makes sense within the aerospace context. It's hard, but it's exciting. And it's something that we think is just going to get way more people involved in their space program, and believing, like we do, that it's an imperative of humanity to figure out how we get ourselves off this planet in a sustainable way.